I'm very pleased to be here and having received the task to present the Swiss team input into the inquiry project. I also feel a bit ashamed because what can we really contribute after the Swiss inquiry team has already been thinking for over 12 months. I hope we can still provide some added value with the thoughts we collected in the Swiss team. We were a very diversified team, ranging all the way from insurance specialists, asset managers, pension funds, service providers, to academia, so quite a broad team that provided input for this report. And what are the results that we would want to hand on to the UNEP inquiry project? I will group my input into 4 different sections. First, some introductory remarks. Then I will address the key challenges that was perceived by the Swiss team. We will then show the Swiss case, or at least provide some positive examples from Switzerland, where we think some Swiss institutions can be a role model, and then some recommendation for action before naming the authors. Some introductory thoughts. What is the overall objective if we want to have a financial system that promotes a green and inclusive economy? It has to be a system that is designed for sustainable finance, and we reach the objective if finance equals sustainable finance. We will no longer have to differentiate between general finance and specifically sustainable finance. I think that's the overall objective. And this has to be reflected in different elements. It has to be reflected in standards, in metrics that are used in financial processes. It has to be reflected in incentive structures. We think that's quite important. And last but not least, in regulation. Why last? I think our team was of the opinion that we don't need a lot of new regulation. We need industry initiatives, and a lot is there already. We need promotion of existing knowledge, first and foremost. What does the UNEP inquiry project look like from a Swiss perspective, or what can it help? How can it help Switzerland to promote itself? I think one thing that we would like to highlight is that Switzerland has a really strong base to build on. It was mentioned in one of the breakout sessions. Switzerland clearly is strong when it comes to environmental standards, and that is rooted in a strong environmental regulation. Our environmental law is based on the precautionary principle, on the polluter pays principle, on the principle of addressing the root cause, but also on cooperative principles. I think we have a strong history there. Also, a lot of environmental organizations are actually based in Switzerland. We can only profit from this. Then, Switzerland clearly has economic strengths. We were named by WEF for the 5th time in a consecutive period as the most competitive country in the world. This results in many patents that are listed for Swiss companies. Generally, I think Switzerland really has a strong economy. And thirdly, Switzerland has a strong financial center. As explained by the share of GDP in Switzerland, it's roughly 10% resulting from finance, from banking and insurance. Switzerland is still the #1 center for cross-border asset management in private banking. I'm not quite sure if this is something we can be so proud of, but let's use it. Let's use it for the best of this world. So clearly, 3 strong pillars to build on. Why should we not use them and take it forward? And we already have quite a lot of strong players in sustainable finance. I will address that later. Now I come to the second part. What are the key challenges? I start with 3 critical factors so far hindering the transition to a sustainable financial system. Our team was of the opinion that these 3 critical factors are the failure of prices to reflect true costs, a disconnect between long-term impacts and short-term decisions in the financial center, and thirdly, generally still an instability of the financial system. I would like to highlight all 3 points a bit more in detail. I think we all agree, generally prices today do not reflect true costs. And against this backdrop, there still is a lack of reliable and robust standards or accepted best practices on how to integrate environmental, social, and governance factors into financial decision-making. I mean, let's face it, if we look at the second point on this slide, if we had a carbon price that gets the system to the 2 degrees Celsius, we wouldn't have to be here today. If prices would reflect true costs, we wouldn't need this way around of setting other standards. But we all know it's rather unrealistic that we'll have such global frameworks soon, so we will need other standards of trying to work around. Another example that I found quite impressive, one academic study is quoted in our input report, looking at the value of ecosystem services, and the scientists estimated this value at the double of global GDP. So ecosystem services really provide a lot that is not calculated in financial processes. So clearly still a failure to reflect true costs. The second challenge, differing time horizons. We all know generally expected incorporation of the risks and opportunities associated with ESG aspects are likely to materialize far in the future. Yet reporting cycles, but also incentive schemes are mostly short-term. And financial analysts often say, well, but we don't just look at the next 2 years. We look at how a company will perform over the next 30 years. But we also know if the cash flows are affected in 30 years' time, it really discounts to almost zero today. So nevertheless, they live in a reality where future risks are discounted too much and do not have a true effect in today's decisions. We also think that there's a lack of examples where it's proven that it will have a crucial effect on the value of companies. We know that we now slowly see the tendency to give value to the risk of stranded assets, especially when it comes to fossil fuels, but we still stand at the very beginning there. And then another challenge we see when it comes to time horizons, that often we talk about more illiquid assets, especially in the field of infrastructure investment, and there a lot of institutional investors still struggle to invest in such vessels because they have restrictions, also regulatory restrictions. And generally, some of the investors find it difficult to invest across cycles, to not develop a pro-cyclical behavior. I think that's also just rooted in the system. The third critical point is generally still the instability of the financial system. We know that in this millennium we've had more than one financial crisis so far. We do not know what lies ahead if there should be a Grexit, for example. Will the systems be stable? Is it enough what has been implemented so far? We know banks have to have more equity, but will it be enough to protect them from systemic failure? We don't know yet. Also, something that we see as quite problematic is that in this new regulation that was implemented as a result of the financial crisis, just to name Basel III or Solvency II, ESG aspects were not really integrated. It was still in a traditional mindset that these changes were implemented. So much about the challenges. How did the team define the guiding preconditions for the way forward? So what are the guiding principles that we think are important when defining a new system? First and foremost, a financial system should serve the real economy. I was quite pleased when Simon Zadek pointed this point out this morning and said it made the Swiss input special. The fact that we bring the role of the financial system back to the roots, it has to serve the real economy. The second principle, natural, after what I said, we should manage to value true costs, independent of the fact if we have a global agreement or global prices of natural goods or not. We should just do it to anticipate changes. The third principle, the precautionary principle, do no harm, you could also call it. We think we have to make sure that in the financial system we do not violate general standards, globally agreed standards. For example, just to name the ban of cluster bomb and landmines, it should be reflected in financial services that you no longer invest in these kind of companies. But there are other factors to not make it possible that you invest in serious environmental degradation, for example, that should just be part of the system. And last but not least, rule of law. We are active in a regulatory, in a legislative environment. These legislations should make sure that financial companies cannot profit or make profits, but then leave the damage to the society. So clearly, who makes the profit also has to carry the risks. That should be a principle. And another aspect when it comes to laws, they should be long-term. We shouldn't see big disruptions because that's just poison for long-term thinking if investors always have to anticipate that the regulatory environment will change again. So that brings me to a more positive chapter, the Swiss case. I think we can be proud to build on a vast experience in Switzerland when it comes to sustainable finance. We have well over 200 dedicated organizations already active in this field. You see here just a selection of logos, many of which are members of SSF, but certainly all the organizations that contributed to this report are examples of organizations with an innovative capacity. And clearly we can build on a strong base here. And I would like to highlight this with a few examples. Where have Swiss organizations been innovators when it comes to sustainable finance? In Switzerland, the first sustainable global index family was set up. We all know it was by Sam together with Dow Jones. And I think the Dow Jones Sustainability Index is still very important in just illustrating what are good companies, how can an investor actually allocate capital to sustainable leaders. We then had the first environmental efficiency fund set up in Switzerland. That was by Sarrazin. It was the first fund that didn't invest in environmental technology, but instead in companies of all sectors that had a higher environmental efficiency. That was in the mid-90s, so we really go quite some time back. Then we had a very early integration of ESG risks in credit and lending by our very large banks. And I think they're still at the forefront when it comes to developing systems on how you actually assess ESG risks in lending, in project finance, and the likes. We then had a small Swiss foundation grouping Swiss institutional investors very early in order to influence Swiss companies in their behavior. I'm talking about Ethos, who is still having an engagement pool, who does voting or makes voting recommendations for Swiss companies, and has attracted quite some Swiss institutional investors who so far lagged a bit behind when it comes to sustainable investing. But they're active in this domain. Then an infrastructure fund was set up in the aftermath of the discussions around the new Swiss energy strategy, an infrastructure fund investing in Swiss projects in renewable energy for Swiss pension funds. It's not always easy to find enough projects here in Switzerland, but I think it's a very good product to also guide capital into new infrastructure. The Geneva Finance Research Institute has established an academic conference to show how much valuable research is out there, and they've held it twice so far, and it has always attracted a big variety of participants, and we've seen very interesting academic inputs at this conference. A nature conservation note was launched at the beginning of this year or end of last year to invest in sustainable ecosystem management. It was Credit Suisse who came up with this innovation, and I think it's really a new approach on how you can invest in ecosystem services. And last but not least, have you ever heard of a fair trade fund before? A fund where you can specifically invest in providing sustainable agricultural goods and innovation by responsibility. Just some examples of Swiss innovations. And something that I would also like to mention is that Switzerland has quite some approaches that we thought are valuable when addressing sustainability. Cooperation is such a principle. And in Switzerland, we've seen close cooperation between finance specialists and large banks, for example, in providing microfinance funds. Not every bank has to reinvent everything. They can cooperate with specialists and then leverage innovations that are there already. Another principle, public-private partnership. I have heard a lot of criticism about public-private partnership recently, but I was told in Switzerland on a communal level, it is normal business. If you have to finance infrastructure at canton level, at community level, these people or public servants always contact their local bank and they find ways to finance such projects. And another part where we maybe are not leading yet, but I see a clear, promising way in the future. We have new clients in private wealth management. There are younger generations that want to have more impact, and we clearly think this is something that Switzerland could build on. Private wealth management, integrating ESG aspects, showing how we can have impact with your investments, that's something we see as promising for the way forward. Now, what are the recommendations for action that the Swiss team would want to give into the UNEP inquiry project? I will focus on 3 points: public actions and framework conditions, then private action, self-regulation and incentives, and valuing true costs. Again, it is important. Public action and framework conditions. Here the team is clearly of the opinion that stable political environments with long-term regulatory changes and not fast changes are key when it comes to long-term thinking and also when it comes to committing to long-term investments. Investors need legal and planning certainty, not just investors, also the companies implementing such projects. Another point could be tax incentives. We've discussed this in the team. Not all people are of the same opinion, but I think there is room for tax incentives for sustainable investments. There could be an example such as the Swiss stamp duty, which makes it rather difficult to emit bonds. If we would waive the stamp duty for green bonds, maybe we could make Switzerland a green bond center. Just one example. Maybe there are other ways of fostering sustainable financial products with tax incentives. And last but not least, if we talk about institutional investors, we do think there is room to change some of the legislation and make it easier for pension funds, allowing for long-term investments in green infrastructure. Not just pension funds, also insurance companies, I mentioned it. There are some barriers to it today, be it only in creating new asset classes and not putting it into existing boxes. So much for political actions and legislative frameworks. The team is of the opinion that private action is more important. It's really in the hand of banks, of investors to just get active. Because let's face it, nowadays you can invest sustainably and you get equal performance. Maybe you even lower your risk. So it's not about a disadvantage to actually take ESG issues into account. But, of course, banks still have to do their homework. One point is systematic integration of ESG factors in all financial decisions. Also, as a reaction to increasing client demand, we really need pension funds who approach banks and say, I want a mandate where you include ESG risks. That should be part of more of the RFPs that banks receive. But then banks have to be prepared and have to integrate such aspects both vertically, let's say on an asset allocation level, on the level of individual issuers when they assess them, but also horizontally, not just in one boutique, but in all the different boutiques. So ranging from fixed income to equity to balanced offering, it should just be integrated everywhere. The second point, client-focused product offerings and more active advisory, taking ESG into account. We still see that a lot of clients would actually be willing to invest sustainably, but relationship managers often hold back from recommending such products, be it because they fear the complexity, be it that they fear to having to talk about issues that are not their home ground. I think we need more training on this level. And this is something that we will also be addressed in the last point. Training generally is certainly a requirement. If someone goes through financial training today, be it at university or be it at technical schools, he most likely still doesn't hear anything about sustainable finance. And we have to change this. Thirdly, reorientation of financial players' incentive schemes. We all know the incentive schemes are mostly still very short-term and hardly ever build on any ESG KPIs. So clearly some room for action there. And last but not least, what's our recommendation concerning valuing true costs? There needs to be comparable and reliable data on ESG factors that can be used by financial analysts, for example. We all know there's a wide array of initiatives. We have the CDP, we have GRI, we have, I can't name them all. And nevertheless, a lot of our financial analysts still don't use this raw data. They need it in their systems, they need better comparability. And I think quite some work has to be done on this level still. And here it is again, integration of ESG into finance courses. That's crucial as well. So much for the recommendations. And to sum up, I show you this chart that you probably can't read, but nevertheless I wanted to bring it with me. The team was of the opinion that it really needs all different actors teaming up in bringing this topic forward. It can't be just the banks or just the investors. We need all players, starting with service providers on the left, key investors group in the middle, with financial service providers as intermediaries, non-business sectors on the right, be it the public sector, be it academia or other NGOs. They all need to work together to really redirect capital in a sustainable real economy and therewith contribute to a sustainable development. So a multi-actor approach is absolutely crucial. But if we manage to bundle all these motivated actors, then I'm sure we can be successful. And it's actually the approach of Swiss Sustainable Finance to have actors of all these fields on board and really try and bring them together. Now, last but not least, I want to give tribute to all the authors of this report. You see the list of names here. All these people have contributed to the report, and the ones with the asterisks have contributed even more by being part of the editing committee and really writing it down, which is often the most difficult part. If I look at the result, I'm quite happy with it. I think there was some input that hopefully is useful to UNEP inquiry. I'm not sure how useful it is for them, but what I'm convinced of, it is all the more useful for Switzerland. Because the fact that we started this discussion, that Bruno Oberle and Pafu grouped this Swiss team and stirred a dialogue and gave this topic visibility is certainly an important first step in also drafting a Swiss agenda for a truly financial Swiss system. And to just quote again Naina Kidwai, who was part of the private wealth management breakout session, she said to Patrick Audier, look, you have all the 3 prerequisites, actually the ones I mentioned. You have a great environment, you have a strong economy, you have a strong financial system. What are you waiting for? Rebrand the Swiss Financial Center. So I finish with this.